want to introduce our speaker. Jennifer Madden is the Director of Collections and Exhibitions at Heritage Museums and Gardens, where she has worked since 1993. Her duties include organizing exhibitions presented at Heritage each year, as well as supervising the care and conservation of all objects in the museum's collection. During her time at the museum, Ms. Madden has organized over 100 exhibitions and published 2 exhibit catalogs. She earned her BA in anthropology with a minor in museum studies at Beloit College in Beloit, Wisconsin, and an MA in history museum studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program in Cooperstown, New York. Jennifer?
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. First of all, show of hands, who has been to Heritage before? Almost everybody. Okay, great. So I will do only a brief introduction to what is Heritage. Heritage is a 100-acre property in Sandwich. We are the largest public garden in southern New England, as well as having 3 museum buildings, an antique automobile museum, a changing exhibitions gallery, an art gallery that features the 1908 working carousel. We have gardens of all types. We're mostly known for our rhododendron and hydrangea gardens, but many other types of gardens as well. We have a STEM-based school at our facility as well that does pre-K through grade 2, called the 100-Acre School. And some of you may have been to Gardens Aglow, our holiday light program. That is the way that people often hear about us. I did hear some people talking about Gardens Aglow. I'll just say now, public service announcement, that if you would like tickets to Gardens Aglow and you find that they're sold out, you must put on your calendar to buy tickets in October. Okay, so it might be sooner than you're used to thinking about Christmas, but we do sell that program out. Tickets are all in advance. That's when you should be looking for those. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you today about our antique car collection. We have 42, as of Saturday will be 43 antique vehicles in our collection. They are all American. They range in age from 1899 to 1962. We're going to talk about, not all of them, only some of them today, and give you a little bit of the history of how the collection came to be and how we manage the cars today, what we do with them, etc. So first, how did this museum come to be? Mr. and Mrs. J.K. Lilly III. So it's Josiah K. Lilly III of the Lilly pharmaceutical family in Indianapolis. His father was a summertime resident of Falmouth. And so we say our Mr. Lilly, since they all had the same name. Our Mr. Lilly spent his summers on the Cape since childhood. And then when he was an adult, moved to Falmouth year-round. So in March of 1964, so this is before the museum was founded, he and his wife were vacationing outside of Palm Springs. And they were at Smoke Tree Ranch. And while they were there, an antique car parade drove past them with everybody dressed in historic riding costume. And they thought, oh my gosh, these people are having so much fun. We need to get in on this act. So before they left, they talked to Donald and Genevieve Gilmore of Kalamazoo, Michigan, who had organized that event and also had their own car museum in Michigan, and found out about the organizations that were promoting antique cars. And before they left California, they joined the Horseless Carriage Club as a member. And in the Horseless Carriage Club publications, they noted, in the for sale listings, they noticed a 1916 Simplex crane, which was for sale in West Newton, Mass. So when they got back to the Cape, they went to visit Frank Gardner. Remember that name? We're going to hear that again during our presentation today. And they bought their very first car, this 1916 Simplex crane. You can see what it looked like when Mr. Gardner had it, and then what it looked like after Mr. Lilly had it painted. So the Lillys very, very quickly, so that was in March of 64. Just between March and December of 1964, Mr. Lilly bought another 7 vehicles. The next year he bought 11. The year after that he also bought 11. So once he got started with this, he really, got going. He had the means to do it, first of all, but I think it's important to understand that his father was a huge collector of all different types of things. He collected something like 25,000 rare books and manuscripts and gold coins from around the world and firearms and artwork and all different types of things. So Mr. Lilly came from a collecting family. His uncle also collected. And I think it was just sort of habit for him because it had been modeled for him that if you're interested in a topic, you form a collection of it and study it that way, not just read about it in books. So when he decided he was going to start this car collection, he started by looking at ads in the automobile publications or the Sunday edition of the New York Times. However, once word got out that he was collecting cars, people reached out to him with the cars that they had available. So he quickly filled the garage that he had at his house. Then he rented a nearby building in Falmouth. He filled that up as well. And when a new purchase would come, he would just pile his kids in the car after dinner, and they would go out riding on the streets of Falmouth. So at first he bought restored and unrestored vehicles, but then he learned very quickly that restoration costs could be as much or more than the original purchase price of the car. He went more to buying vehicles that were already restored. When he got up to 30 cars, he started an upgrading program to sell some of the cars that weren't as great and buy better examples. Here, this is Mr. and Mrs. Lilly in their mink coats. They're getting ready for the Christmas parade in Falmouth. Mr. Lilly hosting an antique car club group that came to his garage. I wish you could see the curtains on the windows have antique cars printed on them. You can't see that very well here. And Mr. and Mrs. Lilly, and this is the same car, the Stutz Bearcat, that they had that picture taken for their Christmas card. So they started their collection in 1964, and almost immediately they started talking about opening an auto museum. They did research on auto museums and visited auto museums all around the country. This is when they decided that their collection would not be really big. They went to museums that had hundreds of cars, but they were not all in good condition. And they said, and they had cars from all over the world. They said, it's not what we're going to do. We're going to do a small collection. Everything is going to be beautifully restored, and they're going to be all American cars. And they talked and made plans, drew plans for a freestanding auto museum that was going to be in Mashpee. And then 2 years later, Mr. Lilly's dad died. And I told you he had all of these collections. So his father mysteriously had made no estate provisions. So our Mr. Lilly purchased from his father's collection the collection of antique firearms that I mentioned, about 150 American antique firearms, about 5,500 American military miniatures, some art. And so now, just besides the car collection, he had all of these other collections as well. So their vision expanded to being something more than just an auto museum. They were also very concerned that an auto museum would not draw enough people to be financially successful. So in a way, this helped their vision and their cause and what they were going to do with heritage. So they started looking for property on the Cape that could accommodate what they were thinking of. They looked at various properties. They eventually bought the property in Sandwich, which had been Charles Dexter's home in the 20s, 30s, 40s. He was famous for propagating rhododendrons. It's where our rhododendron collection comes from today. And so they got serious about opening this museum. Question then became, what is the auto museum going to look like at Heritage? And he and the architect showed up at the meeting with the same book marked to the same page, which is Eric Sloane's A Book of Barns. And the building was modeled on a round stone dairy barn that is now at Hancock Shaker Village in Pittsfield, Mass. So that is why it looks like it does. The lumber that they used here was salvaged from antique buildings throughout New England that the architect had like 3 barns full of antique lumber. So they could do that. It makes a magnificent space to show off these cars. The museum opened in June of 1969. At that point, the auto collection had 34 vehicles in it from 1899 up until the mid-30s, and was called the most selective antique and classic car collection east of the Henry Ford Museum. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some specific vehicles. This is our oldest car. It looks like a horse-drawn carriage. It has the word carriage in the name of it. You can very clearly see the transition that people are making, although this is really very, very early for cars. The first cars in the United States are the mid-1890s, so this is a very, very early example. Very horse and buggy design, same height, same wooden body. It has tiller steering in it, like a boat. Again, very common in early automobiles. Alexander Winton, who was the founder of this company, was probably the most important early American automobile manufacturer. He started as a bicycle maker, which so many early automobile makers started. If they were successful, they started by making something else first, transitioned into cars. A lot of the times it was bicycles or horse-drawn carriages. And he introduced his first, what he called motor wagon, in 1896. He was the first company to sell a car to the general public in 1897, and a Winton was the first car to drive coast to coast in 1903. So in 1899, he made and produced exactly 100 vehicles, all of the same design. In 1899, that was considered a remarkable example of mass production of automobiles, 100 cars. The year before that, he had made 22 cars. And he sold one to James Ward Packard, who hated that car. He couldn't stand it. He wrote to Winton and told him all the things that were wrong with his car, and Winton wrote back to him and said, if you can build a better car, I suggest you do so.
So we did.
So we did, right, yes. You've heard of Packards today, is my guess. My guess is you've probably not heard of Winton's, so we know maybe who won that competition. One of our best known cars is our 1909 white steam car. When the museum opened in 1969, Mr. Lilly said, that's it, I'm done, I'm not buying any more cars, finished. Until he got a letter from George Waterman Jr. in the summer of 1971 that said he had 2 cars for sale. One was the white steamer, one was the Winton that we just looked at. And it's funny to read the correspondence as this goes back and forth in the files, and finally Mr. Lilly says, okay, I give up. I must have them. So he bought both of them. Go back to 1909 when this car was new. William Howard Taft was the newly elected president, and he made the decision to buy motor vehicles for the White House. Before this, presidents had only officially been transported in horse-drawn vehicles. Taft was very much in favor of the new invention of automobiles and the widespread adoption of automobiles by not just wealthy people, but everybody in the United States. He did a lot legislatively to make that happen, and he wanted to lead by example. So he bought for the White House 2 Pierce Arrows, which are gas-powered cars, a Baker electric vehicle, and this steam-powered car. This was his favorite of those 4. Now, he was from Ohio. White steamers were made in Ohio. He had a lot of previous experience with them in the Army, so that probably helped things. But he liked how powerful they were, how fast they were, and he could direct his chauffeur to sort of let off well-timed bursts of steam if there were pesky reporters around or something like that, can kind of get rid of them that way. We did get permission to add the White House seal to the side of the car. It had been present before its restoration in the 1960s, but needed to be removed during that process. So in the 80s, Heritage had that redone. And then in 2016, it was the 9th car elected to the National Register of Historic Vehicles. And as part of that, it went on tour to Washington, D.C., and it was displayed in this sort of giant display case on the National Mall, and you can see the Capitol building in the background there. It's a really great honor.
What do they burn to make the steam?
Kerosene.
Kerosene.
Okay, then this is just sort of a nice example of two cars from 1910, sort of at very, very opposite ends of the spectrum of what was available to early car purchasers. And everything here is about who is the audience for this vehicle. What did the people intend? So the top car is our 1910 Sears Surrey. That's Sears as in Sears and Roebuck. Okay, and then 1910 Cadillac down below. Sears intended their cars to be for rural, middle class folks. Okay, so it is, first of all, sold through the Sears and Roebuck catalog. It was mostly assembled, but not completely assembled. It would arrive at the train station closest to you. You went there and finished assembly. It came with the oil you needed, but not the gasoline you needed. BYOG. And then you put it together and you hope that you can drive home, okay? It's very simple, chain drive, tiller steering, high up off the ground, because in rural places in America in 1910, the roads are nothing like we would expect to see them today. There are 2 ruts in the road. It's up high because an improved road was considered a road that had most of the stumps removed, but not necessarily all the stumps removed. You need to be up and have solid tires. Nothing that could puncture, okay? And, I have a great quote. Hold on. I have a great quote from the Sears Motor Buggy Circular of 1909 that described their goal. We have not made any attempt in designing and building the Sears Motor Buggy at copying the automobile. We have made no attempt to build a high-speed or high-powered car. We do not believe that the average man desires to go whirling through the countryside at 40 to 50 miles an hour. We furnish in our Sears Motor Buggy a practical car for every day in the year over rural or city roads. That's how much did it cost? It cost $445. Average annual income that year was $574.
So that's pretty expensive.
So that's 1 year's income, basically, right? All right, so that's the Sears. Cadillac, on the other hand, the complete opposite, okay? This is a very expensive luxury automobile for a suburban or urban owner, somebody who can drive over roads that are in better shape. It's lower, it has inflated tires. If you owned a car like this in 1910, just automatically you had a chauffeur. You employed somebody who could take care of this vehicle, because they were not easy to start, drive, keep going, okay? And it was just the way that it was. And see this has a steering wheel instead of the tiller steering. So I will tell you in a moment how much the Cadillac cost. The Cadillac was $1,795 with the top. With the top.
The top was optional.
So, right, top was optional. So in today's money, that's about $50,000.
But it looks to me like a 2-seater.
There is, it's
rumble seat
hard,
in the back or
yeah, there is a seat right here. It's hard to see in that picture.
But you're sitting up front with your chauffeur.
Well,
Presumably.
or when you want to drive, you put the chauffeur in the back, in that little seat in the back. But if things get, uncomfortable or unpleasant or something, it's hard driving or you need a tire changed or whatever, then you get him to do that while you have a picnic or, whatever.
The steering wheel's on the right, too.
Yes, and that's actually a really important point. A lot of our early automobiles, you will see the steering is on the right. Why is that? Because horse-drawn carriages are driven from the right-hand side. Why? Well, a lot of these early roads, I mean, that's just the way it was, but a lot of the early roads, you are bad conditions. There is often a ditch on your right-hand side that you'd like to keep an eye on and stay out of. Later, it became, and so when cars were invented, that was just the way people were used to driving on roads, and it made sense to put it on the right. Later, when there's increased automobile traffic on the road and you have more cars coming towards you, it can be advantageous to drive on the left-hand side instead to see them better. And at the same time, your road conditions are improving. What really moved this process along to move from right to left-hand drive is Henry Ford. When he brought out the Model T, he put the steering wheel on the left-hand side, and then eventually, and that was for pedestrian safety. So you could pull up to, or whoever's riding in your passenger seat, safety, you could pull up to a curb and they could get out of the car and not have to cross, get out in traffic essentially and cross. He wanted people to be able to just get out right onto the sidewalk or out of traffic. Eventually, for a while, some car companies offered you could order your car with left or right-hand drive depending on what you wanted. Eventually, nobody wanted right-hand drive anymore, and everything just moved to the left. And in the early 20s, probably, there was no more option for right-hand drive. Okay, so when I was asked to give this talk, I was asked to please include a love story, since it's Valentine's Day. And I said, I have no problem with that. I absolutely have a love story to tell you with these cars. So our love story is regarding our 1910 Knox. So up here, the man turning the crank is Frank Gardner. Remember, we talked about him when Mr. Lilly bought the simplex crane from Frank Gardner. Here he is much earlier in life in 1939 when he was 17 or 18 years old with the Knox. Now, he had first seen that car when he was 9 years old in Maine. It belonged to the neighbor, a farmer who was the neighbor of his grandmother. The farmer's name was Mr. Jordan. And Mr. Jordan was using the Knox around his farm. Frank was interested in, old cars since he was a child. Fast forward, he's a teenager now, and he wants to join the Veterans Motor Car Club of America. It has nothing to do with military veterans. It has to do with old, now it's the 1930s, so how old are the cars exactly, but, older cars. And he wanted to take a car to a meet, and he approached Mr. Jordan about could he borrow the car. And Mr. Jordan said yes, that was fine with him. They would arrange a long-term loan. So Frank needed to get the car from Maine to Truro, where his other grandmother lived, and that was where the car would be garaged. His family lived in Boston. It took him and his friend 2 days to drive from Maine to Boston because the tires were in such bad shape. I think you could see the front tire in that picture. You can see all the tape on the lower part of the tire. It was a long story about the tires that we won't go into today because we're concentrating on the love story, which is the woman, the girl really, that's in the front seat holding on to the steering wheel is Eloise. She's 15 years old in that picture. And she and Frank had known each other for a while already. And this is after they got to the Cape in 1939. So they finally made it on the bad tires. It's the summer of 1939. All the friends are gathering there in Truro. He entered the car in 2 4th of July parades, one in Wellfleet, one in Provincetown, and won a first place and a second place awards for the parades. She was with him. The following year, you see her in her riding costume up here as well, also entering some parades. Okay, if Frank is 17 or 18 years old in 1939, you know what happens next, World War II. And he goes off to serve his country. Eloise is waiting for him at home. He gets back safely. They get married. He's still borrowing the car from Mr. Jordan.
That's a long time.
It's a very long borrowing. And I will say that finally, in 1948, Mr. Jordan is willing to sell the car for $200. So Frank buys it. Meanwhile, he and Eloise have married, started a family, having children, and Frank gets polio and ends up paralyzed from the waist down. So that delayed restoring the car. But he finally gets around to restoring the car in 1956. So it's ready to go and test in 1957. He takes it out for its first test drive. He has 2 friends with him. It develops a vapor lock. They pull off to the side of the road. What he has not recognized is there's a fuel, we don't have a picture of it, but trust me when I say that inside the passenger compartment, mounted to the dash right here, is an auxiliary fuel tank. And there was a line open that wasn't supposed to be open, and fuel came up into that auxiliary fuel tank and caught on fire. So he is in there, paralyzed, in the driver's seat. And thank goodness he had his friends with him because he can't get out on his own. They pulled him out over the spare, and the gear shift and the brake are also here that he needed to sort of get out over. And he was fine. He had a singed shirt elbow on his shirt, but otherwise he was completely fine. But this is a picture of the car after it was burned. Completely heartbreaking. So instead of taking it to the junkyard, he had it restored again. And both times he had it restored with hand controls so he could drive it. But eventually he just never felt, even when it was restored and working fine, he never felt like he had control over the vehicle. And so at that point, he'd already sold the Simplex crane to Mr. Lilly. He wrote Mr. Lilly and said, would you also like to buy the Knox? Which he did. He and Eloise stayed married their whole lives until Frank died. Eloise is still living. She must be almost 100 now. We had a visit planned in the spring of 2020. She was going to come down from Boston to ride in the Knox and ride in the Simplex. But then, of course, it was COVID, and she hasn't been able to make it down, but we're still hoping. Right. Okay, what's our next car? Our next car is the Mercer Raceabout. So the Mercer is considered to be sort of the best early American race car that was produced. It had advanced design, good handling, high speed. They won 5 of the 6 races they entered in 1911. They came with the unheard of guarantee at this point that each raceabout would achieve a minimum of 70 miles per hour without modifications on public roads. This is at the time when most cars, this is 1912, okay, most cars are having trouble going 40. So that's really fast. We are 99% sure, well, we can never be 100% sure, that this car was owned by Barney Oldfield, who was a very famous early race car driver in the United States. It has a history that comes with it, that he owned it. It has modifications to it that indicate that it was modified for the type of racing that Barney Oldfield was doing. Every time you see a picture of him, I should put a picture of him in there. He has a cigar in his mouth, and he said it's not because he was smoking it, but because he needed it for cushioning for his teeth during the races. Very fierce competition what was happening between Mercer and Stutz. When I showed you Mr. and Mrs. Lilly for their Christmas card, they are sitting in a Stutz Bearcat. And so Mercer owners would taunt, you must be nuts to drive a Stutz. Right? And the Stutz owner's response was, nothing's worser than driving a Mercer. So this car was in Canada, and the photo at the upper left is the condition of the car when it arrived to Ken Purdy, who was a previous owner and a early automobile historian. He wrote a number of books on cars. This is Ken and his wife up here after the car was restored. And then again, the car as it appears today at the Heritage Collection. 1924, Brewster. Brewster began in 1910 as a manufacturer of very high-end horse-drawn vehicles for wealthy clients. These are super, super fancy vehicles, all right? They made their first auto body in 1896 and then continued building car bodies for European imported chassis. In early car era, if you were buying a luxury vehicle, you bought the chassis separately from the body a lot of times. Now, a lot of places, manufacturers had bodies available that you could purchase from them sometimes. The Simplex that we saw, that was not the case. You needed to contract separately with a coach builder to build the body for your vehicle. So Brewster was one of those coach builders for any kind of chassis that you could bring them. They would do that. But with the outbreak of World War I, those European chassis were not being imported into the United States as well anymore. So they decided that they would build their whole complete automobile. So they had a very unusual engine design in a sleeve valve engine. They were very quiet. They were good for city driving. The oval radiator shape on here was very distinctive. Also the 3 fender design, very unusual. So 1, 2, 3 fenders on here. You'll notice that the chauffeur, and again, this is one of those vehicles where you automatically would have had a chauffeur. The chauffeur sits out front, exposed. Only the passengers are enclosed. So this car was nicknamed the Pneumonia Special. There's also a speaking tube there for the passengers to be able to talk to the driver. So let's see. Price new for this car in 1924 was $7,500. So in today's money, that's $115,000. Right, probably my favorite car in our collection is our 1927 LaSalle, right? In 1924, the DuPont chemical company had developed a new line of automotive, fast-drying automotive paint. And LaSalle was the first company to really sort of take advantage of that new paint. And they offered 482 2- and 3-tone color combinations that you could choose from. So this, you hopefully can see, this is a 2-tone red where the hood is darker than the rest of the body. Based on the LaSalle, so LaSalle was made by General Motors. Based on the LaSalle's success, General Motors started the art and color division and put Harvey Earl in charge. You may have heard about Harley Earl. This was a very rare body style for LaSalle. It's called dual cowl. I should have brought a laser pointer with me. This is the cowl right here, that spot that's just in front of the windshield. And you can just barely see there is another cowl back here for the backseat passengers. So if you're going to get in there, you need to open the door, lift up the cowl, slide in, and then the cowl comes back down towards you. But nice feature of the cowl is when you lift it up, there's a mirror under there. So if your hair has been disarranged by riding in the car, you can get that all set before you get out of the car. Now, this car has won 2 very prestigious awards with the Classic Car Club of America. First, it won a national first place award in 1967, which was just before Mr. Lilly acquired the vehicle. And then in 2012, it won the next highest award, which is called the Senior Badge. No other car has gone that long, 45 years, in between awards on the same restoration. So it really speaks, first of all, to the quality of the restoration it had in the 60s, but also the good conditions that the cars are in at Heritage were all climate controlled, all the year. Most cars, of course, as you would guess, are stored in non-climate controlled conditions. So that's really helped the paint on this. This is maybe our other, besides the White Steamer, our other best known car is our 1930 Duesenberg Model J. Duesenbergs are the most coveted, considered the best auto that the United States ever built. 1930 Duesenberg Model J. 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 1930 The company was founded in 1913 by brothers Fred and August Duesenberg. They were an engine manufacturer, race car manufacturer. They were based in Indianapolis, of course, home to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Not an accident. That speedway was built to test early automobiles, and the Duesenberg brothers did test their cars there. They raced at every Indy 500 between 1914 and 1937, won the race 3 times. Duesenbergs were great, great, great engineers. They were not great businessmen. And the company was bought out by E.L. Cord, and he said to Fred Duesenberg, I want you, now you have been relieved from all these business, management troubles. What I want you to do is concentrate on building the best car that you can. Don't worry about the financials, just design it and build it. So this was the result of that. And it has a great, superlative engineering, a custom body on here. Again, as I said, they're concentrating on the chassis. The body is separate. Because they were so costly and coveted, they inspired the saying, "It's a doozy," is based off of Duesenberg. So this is painted in its original colors, primrose yellow and parkway green. So just as it appeared on the floor of the Chicago Auto Show when it was bought by Gary Cooper. You may know Gary Cooper as a Hollywood actor. He was 20s to the 50s, did a lot of Westerns. He owned the car for at least 5 years. He raced it often. The custom body was already on it. He made some modifications which have been reversed now. Some features that it has that we have on our cars today, but at that time were very unusual: an altimeter, service reminder lights as well, 1930. So the cost to buy this car, we're not exactly sure, but we think it was about $14,000 in 1930, which today would be about $215,000.
You know how big the engine is?
265 horsepower. This car is one of our most popular. People love this car. 1932 Auburn Bowtail Speedster. Auburn was founded in 1900, so really early automobile manufacturer. The automobile manufacturing universe in the 1920s was big. There were thousands of car manufacturers, but a lot of competition. And then with the coming Depression, that put a lot of car manufacturers out of business. So it was near failure, and again, saved by E.L. Cord. Same person who saved Duesenberg is happening here with Auburn. So he changed the production to offer really good looking cars, but not built to the same quality as a Duesenberg, for example. So you could get a good looking car for not that much money. And this was sort of what we'd call clickbait today. This was getting people into the Auburn showroom to look at a car like this, but then you might buy another Auburn that was a little bit more practical for your family. This is 2-seater, there's no storage in here. This is not go to the grocery store or anything like that, right? So very, very Art Deco. You see the boat tail on the back here, which was inspired by the speedboats that were popular at the time. Really just nice looking car. So price to buy was only $975. So today, that's about $19,000. Yep, not bad.
Didn't Cord actually manufacture and sell cars as Cords?
Stand by. Ta-da! See?
What a segue.
What a segue. Amazing. This is our 1936 Cord Westchester. You remember the last 2 cars were purchased by E.L. Cord. It was the Duesenberg, and then it was the Auburn, and now finally Cord has started a car company with his name on it. And he made incredibly innovative cars. He was operating way, way, way ahead of his time. in his manufacturing. So he was the first one to mass produce a car that had front wheel drive on it. The elimination of the rear wheel drive allowed the car to sit much lower than previous cars, so there are no running boards on here. All the cars I showed you previously had running boards on. Now they're gone. It was the first car to have an alligator, like the hoods that we know to get today. They're hinged at the back, alligator style they were called. This is the first car to have that. All the other hoods opened along, had two sides that open along the middle. This is opening at the back. Okay, and that's hard maybe to see from this angle, but coffin nose, front end styling here, concealed door hinges, teardrop shaped fenders, disappearing headlights. You can just barely see where the headlights are right there. They are raised and lowered by individual cranks. You need to crank over here if you're the driver, and then lean. Hopefully you have a passenger, but if you don't, lean over and crank the other one up. Okay. All of these features influence the way cars were designed from the future on. It was unveiled at the New York Auto Show in November of 1935. A sensation. People loved it. But he was just operating so far ahead of his time and rushed to get ready for the show that there were so many new features on this car which were not sufficiently tested in advance that people said, oh my God, this car looks great, but it doesn't actually function all that well. And so sales did not do very well, and Cords did not last only until 1936. Hold on, that's not right. 1937. And then our newest vehicle, our 1962 Corvette. This is, I think, no, I was going to say this is the only car I've shown you that was not originally part of the Heritage Collection that Mr. Lilly bought. But that is not true because the Cord was also, Mr. Lilly had a Cord in the collection originally, but he was not happy with it. It had a cracked engine block, which is very common for Cords. The body restoration was not good. He tried to get his money back. Going back and reading the correspondence between him and the seller, he was not happy. But sorry, if I'm talking about the Cord, let me go back to the Cord. I think, so I've worked at the museum for 30 years. We probably talked about selling that car for 20 years before we finally did and said, you know what, Mr. Lilly really wanted a Cord in the collection. This is not a good example. What we're going to do is deaccession it, which is what we do when we sell something out of museum collections. Reserve the money to buy a new Cord. So then we searched for 2 years probably to find one that's fit our specifications and purchase this Cord so we can have one in the collection and really honor Mr. Lilly's wish to have a very innovative car in the collection, but this is not the original one that he purchased. Okay, back to the Corvette. So rivalries between auto manufacturers are not a new phenomenon. I told you about Mercer and Stutz going at it a little bit earlier. Ford and Chevrolet were doing the same thing in the 60s with the Thunderbird and the Corvette. So the Corvette was based on a 1952 auto show car. It went into production virtually unchanged. That was pretty unusual for the time. It was designed by Harley Earl, who was put in charge of the art and color division after the success of the LaSalle, and marketed as an economical sports car for young adults. When it was released, people liked it, but they didn't buy it. So sales figures are low, and Chevrolet was getting ready to discontinue the Corvette entirely when Ford came out with a Thunderbird. And then they had to keep it to remain competitive. So they redesigned it. This is from 1962. And it's the last year of sort of the initial Corvette designs. The 1963 Corvettes were completely re-engineered, restyled, and came out as the Stingray. This car you see has Massachusetts Antique Plate 1 on it, that was a gift to Mr. Lilly from the Commonwealth to honor his purchase of the White Steamer presidential vehicle. Oh, right, I forgot about our 65. Ignore everything I told you about how our newest car was 1962 because it's 1965.
How much did the vet cost?
The vet new cost $4,038.
That's a lot of money.
So the average annual income that year was $5,155. So just under 1 year's income, and today it's about $35,000. 65 Ford Country Squire station wagon. This is a relatively new acquisition for the museum, which is why it's escaping my mind. So the museum talked about, I'm going to back up even more. Since I've worked at the museum for 30 years, when it's, go back to 1993, I'm younger, people are coming into the Auto Museum. There were more people at that point who could remember the cars that were on exhibit and have personal memories and personal stories of those vehicles. And when museum folks study how people learn in museums, that's how they learn, is they say, oh my gosh, I remember my mother had a container just like that, and let me tell you all the stories about that. That's how they make memories and learn in museums, okay? And that was happening a long time ago with our auto collection, but it was not happening once 30 years go by, all right? So we've formed a group at the museum, and we're talking about what kind of cars are we going to add to the collection? What years are they going to be from? So we talked about cars to add from the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. In the 60s, the story with automobiles in general in the United States is sports cars, like the Corvette and the Thunderbird, and you know we already have a Corvette, right? And the other car story is station wagons, okay? And this is, you know, baby boomers, family vacations.
The car my brothers and I rode in the back.
That is exactly what we're talking about, right?
That's right, that was the best seat in the car.
The seats faced each other
Right.
in the back, yeah.
Yeah. So this reaction of this group is exactly what we were aiming for in the museum. Okay, people come in and say, oh my God, I remember, and your memories come flooding back about riding back there with your siblings with no seatbelts on the way to vacation, it's hot, you know, whatever, okay? So we actually found this car in Hyannis. We went to look at, so the car we want to add from the 1950s we have not yet done, and we don't know what model it is yet, but picture something long and Corvette and fins and chrome, and you know, that's sort of the 1950s car story. And we were in Hyannis to look at a 1959 Lincoln, maybe, and it wasn't the right car for us. And the owner said, well, what are you looking for? And I said, what we really want is a 1960s station wagon. He's like, oh, I have one of those. So we went to another building, and it was covered with a car cover when we walked in, but I loved it even before he took the cover off. I loved the length of it. I loved the shape of it. I loved everything about it. He took the cover off. Sold. It's great. So it wasn't really for sale. He was willing to sell it to the museum. He had a very fair price. We couldn't even negotiate with him because it was so fair. And we just bought it. So this has been a really great acquisition for us. We're really pleased about it. But it's not our most recent acquisition, because last year we were gifted from the New Hampshire Historical Society this 1946 Mercury Woody wagon. This was the kind of car that we were talking about adding from the 1940s. The previous to this, the museum did not have any 1940s vehicles at all. These Woody wagons were obviously used on the Cape pretty extensively by, first of all, station wagon comes from train station. The wagon that would go to the train station to pick up people, usually they were owned by hotels or resorts, would send the wagon to the train station to pick up guests and bring them back to the hotel. They were initially horse-drawn vehicles, but then they were motorized vehicles as well. So that's where station wagon comes from. So many of the resorts on the Cape or individuals had Woody wagons. And then as they got older and they were sold to a second or third owner and they got less expensive, people would use them to take out on the beaches because they're a powerful engine. They could drive on the sand. You can put all your friends and all the surfboards and fishing gear and picnics and everything you need into this vehicle. So this particular car was purchased for Stanley Hamill, who was at that point a student at Harvard University. His family was from the North Shore. His dad wanted him to come home on the weekends. Stanley said, I can't come home, I don't have a car. So his dad said, well, I'll fix that and I'll buy you one. Then you'll have to come home on the weekends. So 1946, obviously World War II is just over. And during World War II, all by presidential decree, all auto manufacturing in the United States had to stop, and those factories turned over to wartime manufacturing instead. So when the war is over in 1845, it takes them a while to get going again with automobile manufacturing. So this was delayed, but finally it was ready. It was purchased at the Mercury dealership on Comm Avenue in Boston, and then his father and his brother picked it up and delivered it to him at Harvard as a surprise. Later, he was on the board of trustees at the New Hampshire Historical Society. He left the car to them in his will, but they couldn't store it, they couldn't use it, they couldn't exhibit it, and worked with us to make a donation of the car to Heritage, and then could honor Stanley's wish that it be in a museum collection and be shared with the public, and we're delighted to have it. And on Saturday, we'll add another car. Our car guys, we just bought a 1942 Willys World War II Jeep to talk about. That's the other car story in the 1940s, obviously, is World War II. So when you have me come back again, I'll tell you about the Jeep. Okay, so we have a group of car guys, as I just mentioned. They are a small group of volunteers who they all have extensive experience with antique automobiles. They get one car running. The goal is to get one additional car running every year. As of Saturday, we'll have 43 cars, about 27 of them run now. So we have a repair plate at the museum, so that allows us to put that plate on any car and drive on public roads. So the cars that are running, they exercise 2 or 3 times a year. As you know from your own personal car, if you don't drive it for a while, you can't get started. Same thing with these cars. So they're exercising those cars. And then in the not nice weather months of the year, they do static maintenance on our cars that don't run. So that's turning the engines over by hand, rotating the tires, making sure the radiators are full, all of that sort of thing. So if we decide to get those cars running again, that we will have preserved their engines in the best shape that we can. We do have an Adopt a Car program, fund, I should say, where people make donations to the fund, and then we use the funds in there to reactivate the historic vehicles or care for cars that are already activated. So the guys this year are working, don't ignore that license plate that says 1915. This is a 1917 Milburn electric car, and this is the car that the guys are working on reactivating right now. We do take cars out to car shows. We go to 4 a year, usually in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So here is the Stutz Bearcat winning the 3rd place at the Audrain Concours d'Elegance, which is held every year in October in Newport. I wanted to just share with you some auto programming. I just assumed that with this lecture and this group, you might be interested in particular in auto programming. So I brought the list with me of our upcoming auto programs. You can look on Heritage's website for all of our programs, but our 51st annual auto show will be on June 10th, Saturday, June 10th, rain date the following day. Gearhead Garage. When you were asking about driving a car, you can't drive a car at Gearhead Garage, but
Can I sit in it?
no. Unless it's a Model T, and then yes.
Okay. Can I kick the tire?
No, you can't. But at Gearhead Garage, we get 2 cars out, and so it happens right after we close for the day. We get 2 cars out in our parking lot. Our volunteers start it and drive it, and you get to stand and look and ask very specific questions and admire it at close range. Okay, so those dates are on here. Cocktails for Cars is on September 9th. That is like a high-end cocktail party with 40 antique cars to look at that people have brought to the museum for that day. You get to really look at them closely, again, talk to the owners, and all of the proceeds from that go to the Adopt a Car Fund.
That's 40 in addition to the 40s you have.
Right, correct. Cars and Caffeine is a morning program sponsored by Haggerty Insurance. That's just bring in as many cars, like, I don't know, we had 60, 70 cars come in the morning, they serve coffee, you walk around, look at everything. Any car can come to that. That's fun. And then Food Truck Fridays I put on here too. Those are not particularly car events, but we have food trucks come to the museum and games and live music, but the car guys get one of our or two of our cars out for that night. And again, you have an opportunity to talk to them and see the car as well. And then I couldn't resist putting in a plug here for our most recent exhibition that I put together called Creating Cape Cod. Have any of you seen Creating Cape Cod? Okay, then required homework is for you to come to the museum and see it. This exhibit has been in the works for, I think, 20 years. I've been thinking about this exhibit. It is talking all about the Cape's evolution into a tourist destination. So it starts in 1840s, talking about Thoreau's visit to the Cape and how early tourists got here on trains, and then once the automobile was invented, how that changed the nature of the Cape Cod vacation. They're all Cape Cod resort or roadside attractions that you know and love are represented. There's a mini golf hole. You can play mini golf in the exhibit. It talks then about, the last section talks about all the unanticipated problems that having a tourism-based economy has created for the Cape, like water quality, housing affordability, that kind of thing. Bridges. And this is in our special exhibitions gallery, but this exhibit also has a branch in our auto building as well, where I borrowed a 1932 Beetle Cat sailboat from the Cape Maritime Museum, is in there with its mast and sail. The Woody Wagon and the Country Squire are there kind of propped out as they would be for your family vacations in the 1960s. I also borrowed a 1930 RV being pulled by a 1929 Packard. Those are both in original barn find condition. Those are from a lender in New York near Albany. So very great opportunity to see those types of vehicles. That's all I have for you. Questions? I'm right on time.
You guys are open year-round?
We are not open year-round. Important point, if you're going to come to Heritage, we open April 22nd, and then we will be open every day through October 16th.